Art history, the Renaissance. Okay, so we are coming out of the Middle Ages here, and we're going to enter this next era, the Renaissance, which is a time period that is very well known for art, and it certainly is a strong time for the arts, and there's a lot of factors that kind of contribute to make that happen here. So first of all, let's look at what the Renaissance means. Renaissance means rebirth. Okay, so if we look at the fact that we're coming out of the Middle Ages, with the Middle Ages, it wasn't completely devoid of life, obviously, here. Things are still going on in the medieval period, but there were certain shortcomings socially. Things didn't really happen on a mass scale like we saw with the Roman Empire. Things happened more on the local level. That other than the church, there just weren't that many civil institutions that were powerful enough to maintain the type of continuity and stability that we had with the Roman Empire. And so when we look at the Renaissance being a rebirth, it was certainly as much of an economic rebirth as it was anything else. It won't just be an economic rebirth, but it'll also be an intellectual rebirth. And those factors are really going to, basically contribute to making the art flourish as it does here. Okay, so the first thing here with the economy, we start to see more of a mercantilism develop, particularly around the Flanders and the Florence area in northern and in southern Europe. And these are the areas where the Renaissance will really kind of develop from. Okay, so we have that important component of economic growth that is going to foster the arts. With the intellectual climate, we've got this real spirit of discovery, of rediscovery, and ambition. The rediscovery is kind of a rediscovery of the classical world, of the culture of the ancient Greeks and then later Romans. And particularly the artists are going to look at the accomplishments of the ancient Greeks in the arts, and they're really going to consider that the high standard. They're going to try to achieve those high standards and maybe surpass them if they can. Now, intellectually, people are looking at some of the works of these ancient Greeks, like some of the philosophers, some of the poets, and they're kind of rediscovering them. And so those ideas, in a lot of cases, are very influential. For instance, Neoplatonic thought is something very influential in this culture here of the Renaissance. And so you have people reading more. So there's this spirit of literacy, of philosophy, this hope in science and development. So you're going to have that spirit, and along with that you have the spirit of discovery, not just rediscovery. For instance, if we look at 1492, the year Columbus sails to America, that's really smack dab here in the Renaissance, and so that's an example of that type of discovery along with the rediscovery. And it is a real ambitious period as well. Okay, so all of these things are definitely going to combine and have its influence on the arts. If there's one thing here, if we can remember back to the ancient Greeks and what is important in their culture, it's the idea of humanism, of all of the things that humans, concern themselves with. And so, different things like beauty, human concept of beauty, of reason, of order, of balance, harmony, all of these things that we respond to as humans, those are things that we're going to see re-emerge here in the Renaissance. That's going to be the major rebirth that we see in the arts. The difference is that we're going to combine the form of naturalism that we see with the ancient Greeks with the subject matter that is coming out of the Middle Ages, which is the rise of Christianity. Okay, so let's look at the first artist here. This is really the forerunner to the Renaissance. His name is Giotto, which is spelled Giotto, Giotto. And this is called the Lamentation. And this is a good example of some of the developments that's starting to happen that's leading to the Renaissance here. And that development it's basically naturalism that we see getting a lot better. If you recall, in the Middle Ages, the art isn't terribly concerned with things like proportion. there's not that much attention paid to them because that's really not the most important thing. It's really the symbolic content that's more important. If we look especially back to different icons that we see, like the Madonna and Child, another example, the Andrei Rublev icon that we looked at, that the attention to proportion and detail of naturalism is not first and foremost, like it is with the ancient Greeks. So we see this development of naturalism in this Giotto example because things are looking more realistic. We have the people, the proportions a little bit better. If we look at the clothing, we don't have those line striations that we see in the Middle Age icons. We see more of a chiaroscuro, that light to dark progression in the way that folds naturally happen. And so that's, along with the proportion there, examples of naturalism getting better. Another thing that really makes it more humanistic is the fact that these people are really showing some real emotion here that would go along with the scene. You see sadness, you see grief from everybody here. I mean, even if you look at the angels there, they're not even technically human, but they're showing these very human type emotions. And so that is a good example of again, how we are developing more towards this humanistic model that we are using here, the model of the ancient Greeks and later Romans. Okay, so this is our first artist of what we consider here the Renaissance, very early Renaissance here. When we look at Giotto, he's working in around the early 1300s. And there's signs that the arts are trying to progress along with society, but there's certain things that Europe's having to deal with. For instance, it's a time of widespread plagues, and particularly the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it was known. It was believed or it is believed in the year 1348, that an entire third of Europe's population was wiped out. And so that, it's going to have a big impact. If you can imagine 1 out of every 3 people, dying in a calendar year, it's going to take a little while to reboot from that. Okay? And so that is what happens. And then by the early 1400s here, when Masaccio was working, we really see kind of a culmination of the efforts that started, almost 100 years there before. And so with Masaccio, he's a very, very interesting figure here in art history because kind of like in one fell swoop, you have all of the modern technological advancements in painting as far as how to make a painting naturalistic. The first thing is you have this development of chiaroscuro that you start to see with Giotto. If we notice the figures there, the way that the figures are rendered, you have this real smooth progression from light to dark, and so it creates this three-dimensional form with the bodies as well as with the drapery. And the drapery gives that same type of light to dark progression. We have a very consistent light source where we all have, or they all have shadows there that show that type of three-dimensional form. In addition to that, we have this insistence on proportion, that the bodies are much better proportioned than the bodies that we see beforehand. We also have the development of linear perspective, or scientific perspective. That, for instance, one of the ones that we saw, the examples of medieval art, when we saw the Madonna and Child, she was sitting on a throne, and the throne wasn't making exactly the best sense in terms of spatially. It didn't really adhere to the laws of perspective. But in this example, in this painting, if we look at that building there on the right of the left-hand painting there, the tribute money, we'd see that the building adheres to one-point linear perspective, and so it sits well there into space. And so that, along with the scientific perspective, if we notice that the things in the background have less detail than the things in the foreground here, that it's an example of that scientific as well as atmospheric perspective. And so all of those things are combining to make things look much more naturalistic than art we've seen beforehand. Okay, if we look on the right, we see Adam and Eve being expelled out of the Garden of Eden here. And so you can see the same type of thing, that little building there, slightly, it's really kind of hard to see, but it's what atom is emerging out of there, that kind of arc-looking thing. It's done in the same type of linear perspective. We have the same light source again. We see the rendering the figures in this chiaroscuro manner, light to dark, instead of using those line striations. So all of those things, as well as the emotion that they're displaying there, that it looks like they're in grief. They can see, you can see they have some type of shame and kind of horror here by being expelled out of paradise. So we see that on their faces as well as their body language as they walk out there. And so all of that is really adding to the sense of humanism, the naturalism that these artists are going to aspire to. Okay, our next artist here is Donatello. And Donatello is a sculptor. And he's really kind of seen here as kind of this artistic genius of sorts, at least maybe to a certain extent that we would kind of recognize that today, that in the Middle Ages that largely artists were kind of considered just common laborers. But Donatello is really an artist's artist. He is very good at kind of displaying different types of expressions and emotions and different feelings with his work. And so on the left here we see an example of David, one of his sculptures. And you can see the feeling that you get from the David on the left is quite different than the sculpture of his on the right there, Mary Magdalene. And so if we look at David on the left, we can see that the story of David and Goliath is being shown. And we'll see that David is a very popular subject that we see basically because of the city Florence, where a lot of these artists emerge. David is a pretty go-to example of sculpture that the city likes to commission there. But we can see David here. He's being shown in this contrapposto pose. That's something that we are getting obviously here from the ancient Greeks, that S curve that's going to balance out the sculpture. We can see he's standing triumphantly on the head of Goliath there with his left foot, and he's got a sword in the right hand, and his left hand he's got his slingshot. He's got his helmet on, and not much else there. You can see he's got this kind of youthful exuberance to him, this kind of confidence that is coming from him after slaying the Goliath there. And that is very different than the feeling on the right, where we see Mary Magdalene, and it's quite the opposite. We have kind of this feeling of instead of youthful exuberance, it's kind of the feeling of being worn down, of kind of beaten down by life, of this kind of haggard type of appearance. And so we also see the artist working in two different types of sculpture here. On the left we have the bronze example, so it's an example of something that's been cast, versus the carved example on the right that would have been carved out of wood. And so we see that. We also see him carving out of marble and different different types of rock as well. So he's well versed in the types of things that he uses, as well as the different expressions that he can create with his sculpture. Okay, this is an example of a painting we see from the Renaissance as well. Donatello and Masaccio are really working in the early 1400s, and the Renaissance develops throughout the 1400s. And so later on here we see Botticelli, and this is his Birth of Venus. And this is an example of just how influential the work of the ancient Greeks and Romans are, because the subject matter here is the birth of Venus, which would be out of mythology, not even using the Christianity as the subject matter. Now it should be noted that in the climate of thought there, that even though this is the birth of Venus, it can represent certain aspects of Christianity too, like Venus could possibly represent even Mary or some other figure like that, depending on how it's read. So that is a part of the painting that we probably wouldn't first off think about, but in their culture these different aspects of things aren't necessarily seen as opposed to each other as much as they are seen as just kind of various various illusions or various different associations you can make between them. But anyway, it's a very good example of again how influential the ancient world is being here to their artwork. All right, so now we get to what we call the High Renaissance, when the Renaissance is kind of reaching its maturity here. And the first artist we see is Leonardo da Vinci. You can see that's his Mona Lisa there on the top left. In the center we have this little sketch that we would have from his notebooks, a drawing there on the top right. And then on the bottom, The Last Supper, one of his other very famous works. And Da Vinci was a very good example of someone who really personifies the idea of a Renaissance man, someone who had a lot of various interests and was good at a lot of different things. And he's a very interesting figure to study because he really did have a lot of interests. He had a lot of mechanical interests as an engineer would, a lot of biological interests as a scientist would, along with that anatomical interests as a doctor would. He really just had an unrelenting curiosity to figure out, or to try to figure out how things worked. He even created a lot of mechanical type of devices. It's said that he worked on everything from military machinery and mechanical apparatuses to even botanical sketches that we see, and autopsies even. And in addition to all that, he was actually even considered an accomplished musician in his day. He had a pretty unrelenting quest here for knowledge. There were certain things he was really kind of obsessed with that we can tell from his notebooks. For instance, the anatomy is something he's really well known for. He kind of viewed the human body as a machine, really liked to figure out how it worked. He was interested in how flight worked and how to divert water flow, were some interesting or interests of his that we can tell from his volume of notebooks after his life there. And so that part of him is interesting because he does possess this intellectual curiosity that we see during the Renaissance. And he's also, in terms of art here, someone who worked very naturalistically as well. And so we see a little evidence of that by that drawing on the top right. He did a lot of sketching and underwork for his finished portraits, like we see with the Mona Lisa there on the top left. And with the Mona Lisa, it's also an example of how he would develop kind of his own techniques. He would use a lot of thin layers and slowly build up the form from light to dark, so it was more of a seamless transition. And it kind of has this particular look about it, kind of a soft type of feel that he's able to accomplish there with the very smooth progression there of light to dark, the way he's using his technique. Okay, so that would be kind of a good example there. Another example would be his Last Supper, something that's still very well known. Unfortunately, with part of his his idea of always trying to innovate here, this particular mural hasn't really held up well over time because it's believed he was experimenting with a process that didn't work out so well, unfortunately. But very interesting figure, someone who really does, like I said, personify this idea of a Renaissance man who can do a lot of different things. Okay, this next artist, who is a little bit younger than Leonardo, would be Michelangelo. And like Leonardo, he was well versed in a lot of different skills. Michelangelo really saw himself as a sculptor, and that was the type of art form that he really preferred to do. And these are two examples of two of his earliest sculptures. We have the Pieta there on the left and David there on the right. And so here you can see, especially with David on the right, how at this point already the Renaissance has really kind of achieved what it's trying to achieve. That if we look on that David example, it would be really hard to tell the difference between that statue and a Greek statue. That he's really getting all of the naturalism, that balance, harmony, beauty, and proportion, all of those things that we see with the ancient Greeks, we see here with David. The only difference is the subject matter, that David is a Christian subject matter, whereas with the ancient Greeks, they would have used, a Greek god or goddess in their sculpture. And so here, like I said, we've really kind of achieved the whole point of achieving that classical ideal and that classical standard of art there. And so after Michelangelo works on these, he actually turns his hand to this next project, which he originally didn't want to do here, the Sistine Chapel. And this is one of the most well-known pieces of art really in the world still today. Even though it was painted 500 years ago, we still have tons of visitors to the Sistine Chapel each year. And so this is basically just a ceiling that he's painting. And you can see here he's painting the top of the ceiling to mimic the architecture of the chapel, which you can see there with the windows there on the side. So he's painting it to look kind of all like it's the same type of structure there, and that gives the structure for the different panels of the paintings, which each of those are showing different prophets or prophetesses from the Old Testament, as well as scenes of Genesis through the middle stripe there. And so if we view close in there on this little panel here, we'll see that this is what it looks like. And so it's a little better closer up example here of the type of work Michelangelo is doing here, of how he's personifying the serpent here. You can see that's a very good example of humanism here, because the serpent that is handing Eve here the forbidden fruit is, half serpent, but the other half is shown as being a human being. Okay, and so you can see that it's a very good example of the humanism of the period, that the serpent here is half human, half serpent there. And so we see Michelangelo's rendition of Adam and Eve here, very similar to the Masaccio version that we saw earlier. Okay, so Michelangelo, in addition to doing sculpture, doing painting, drawing, turns to architecture later in his life, becomes very influential as an architect, and is even an accomplished poet in his day. So he's another example of this Renaissance ideal. Okay, another person would be our final Ninja Turtle here, Raphael. And so with Raphael, he's the youngest of these three here of the High Renaissance. And we can see on the left, this is the School of Athens, and so you can see that that classical subject matter here coming to fruition again. And on the right, we see the other interest here of the Renaissance, the Christianity that we see in the Transfiguration, that picture there on the right. And so on the right, if we look at the Transfiguration, we can see the influence of not only Leonardo but also Michelangelo. We can see that with the gestures of the hands, especially in the grouping of people, something that Leonardo did, Raphael seems to be taking that influence and using it in his work. He's also taking a lot of what Michelangelo does, as far as the bright colors that Michelangelo would use, the way he would render the figures in terms of the chiaroscuro that he would use, almost a sculptural type of effect with the amount of three-dimensional form that comes across there is something that he's getting there too. So Raphael, very, very talented guy, along with Michelangelo and Leonardo. Okay, so that's basically the Renaissance there in Italy. We have the same type of thing developing in northern Europe, around the Flanders area, which is kind of present-day Netherlands area, northern Germany, that type of area. And so these are two works of art by Jan van Eyck. The one on the left is called the Arnolfini portrait, and the one on the right is called the Virgin of Chancellor Rollin. And these are two of the earliest paintings that we see done in oil. that oil painting is a development of this area that only later moves down to Italy. And you can see how much detail, it's actually kind of hard to see how much detail because you really have to zoom in to see how much detail these things actually have. But it's an example of some of the things that you can get with oil paint and why it becomes such a well-used media really throughout the ages here. But again, we can see the same type of development in terms of the naturalism of the figures. You can see, especially on the right, just the type of landscape that we get, the atmospheric perspective that we get, the use of linear perspective that we get. That's similar to what we see with the Renaissance in Italy and how it becomes so naturalistic. Okay, another thing that we see really is pretty popular in Northern Europe, maybe more so than Southern Europe, are these genre scenes, as they're called, which are paintings that basically are about everyday life, that kind of dignify everyday life. And this one is by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and this one is called the Netherlandish Proverbs. And so there's different proverbs here that he's showing going on here at the same time. And so it kind of makes for this interesting composition with all of these things going on. I'm sure probably not all of these things would be going on here at the same time in this particular town here, but it is an example of a particular type of art that would have been popular with Northern Europe. In addition to that, in Northern Europe, you also see a lot of subjects that are popular in Southern Europe too, things that have to do with Christianity. As a matter of fact, a lot of these proverbs that would have been known are from that tradition there. And if there's one kind of genius here with the Northern Renaissance, it would be this guy Albrecht Dürer. He was largely a printmaker, produced an awful lot of printmaking examples, especially engraving, was exceptionally good at engraving, also did other forms of printmaking too, and very good at drawing, very good at do watercolor landscapes too. He was among the first people to do that. And on the right is a self-portrait he did of himself in paint as well. So he worked in a lot of different medias, like the other artists that were well known at this time too. But again, very very talented artist here of the Renaissance. You can see the type of naturalism he's able to achieve either through drawing or through printmaking or through painting. Okay, and our last thing here for the Renaissance is architecture. With this particular architect, it's a very influential architect. His name is Andrea Palladio, and the name of this is the Villa Rotonda, or Villa Rotonda. And you can see that some of the same themes that we see with their art in two-dimensional art are happening here with architecture, that we see the classical style kind of coming back. But instead of seeing kind of the humanism that we see in the art of two-dimensional art, in here we see the forms of architecture in the classical sense. For instance, those columns, that kind of triangular front there with each of those entrances, that would be very Greek. We see the arch connecting that front portico there in the entrance with the main body of the sculpture. So that arch, the columns, the triangular front, the little dome thing on the top, all of those are very classical elements. And of course we see the sculptures used with that and various points of the architecture as well. And so using all of those together is what gives this its particular Palladian style, as it's called. And so he becomes a very influential architect because he publishes a lot of his designs. And so when the printing press is working at this point in history that has happened, and so he publishes his designs, and so that's one of the reasons it becomes so influential, that when people are looking to build throughout Europe, even in America at some point, and they're looking for different designs to build with, a lot of times they will choose his design because he has his kind of illustrated in these books. But again, it's using these classical types of styles and kind of integrating them together into this kind of this Renaissance style would be the work here of Andrea Palladio. Alright, so this is it with the Renaissance, and the next time period will be Baroque art.